So maybe time for a bit of an update. There hasn't been too much aviation content on my channel over recent months. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. Let's see, the last, I guess, aviation related content was notably the Honeycomb Aeronautical Alpha Flight Yoke. Done quite a bit on that, and that's gone down reasonably well. Before that, I think the last major thing was the construction of my new autopilot. I think the hardware related videos are the ones I have most inclination to be making these days. But going back to the flight sim, I did do a flight sim video a couple of weeks ago, just a kind of nothing video really. That was the $1,000 burger where I just took the Twin Otter up and flew it between a couple of airports. That went down really well. You know, that's an indication that people are interested in that kind of thing, but it's really difficult because I've kind of sort of run out of things to motivate me to create videos. And some of the reasons behind that are the Twin Otter. You know, I've stuck with the Twin Otter since 2014 was when I started to build this cockpit, and I did that whole sequence of videos. You know, the Twin Otter's kind of gone off the boil for me, partly because at the end of the day it's not really as deep a simulation as I thought it was going to be, and it's really not very deep simulation at all. And although I've put a lot of effort into creating many of the buttons and switches for the cockpit, you know, most of those really are inconsequential in day-to-day flying. The other thing is the Twin Otter doesn't behave I mean, it works fine in P3D mostly, with the notable exception of ground handling. The ground handling is just abysmal. It's faulty, and that was something that was changed. I think between 4.2 and 4.5 something changed, and the ground handling was just appalling. So that just makes it a drag for taxiing. So just coming back to the hardware for the moment, I think the configuration I have for my cockpit at the moment, this is by far the best, visually speaking, the best configuration I've ever experimented with. So we've got this 3-screen display with the angled down displays, so we get something of a downward and sideways view as well as the forward view. So I'd really like to stick with that whatever I do next. But the problem is performance. This is one of the other great demotivating factors that have, you know, taken the fun out of flying. I've never got satisfactory performance across the board with this setup, and I think it's the 3-screen setup is really largely to blame for that. I'm using a view group to give me 3 independent displays. I can't use NVIDIA Surround with the screens in this orientation, and that view group, the performance is just dragged down too much. There are situations where I can fly and the performance is reasonable. If I fly without weather, that's a great performance boost, but nobody likes to fly without weather. What's the point of that? But even with weather, in some areas it's acceptable by and large, but in other areas, and I'm talking about Orbix land class scenery as well, you know, the True Earth is just, I've got a couple of the True Earth sceneries from Orbix and they're great, but they're just unflyable, and it doesn't matter what I do to the settings. Again, so I think it's down to this view group and the performance of my computer in conjunction with that. So what about the future? Well, let's see. We've got 2 different things to say here. One is, what am I going to do about the performance and the hardware? And that includes the choice of platform. We're at a bit of a crossroads here, a multi-way junction. We're at mid-2020, and there's a number of alternative ways forward, which I'll talk about in a minute. The other thing is what to do, you know, whether to stick with the Twin Otter. I think in the long term the answer to that is no, I won't stick with the Twin Otter for the reasons I mentioned. But let's talk about platforms first. I'm on P3D 4.5, and as I say, the performance is just not really there. P3D version 5 has been released, so that is an option, and one of the things that's encouraging is that the word from Lockheed Martin is the view group performance has some significant improvements, largely because the change to P3D version 5 also entails a step up to DirectX version 12. Now that carries with it its own drag factors, which is you really need to upgrade to Windows 10 to use that. I'm on Windows 7 Pro at the moment, So that's going to be an upgrade and a half to go to P3D version 5, but the benefit to that hopefully is, I mean, whether it will be into the acceptable range of performance on my current hardware is debatable, but there should be a step up in performance. Now, I have no problem investing in new hardware if I can be sure there's going to be a major performance boost, but we'll have to see about that. The other option is, you know, the wild card is Microsoft Flight Simulator, or FS 2020 as some people are referring to it by. So that's due to come out, well, it's due to go into beta, closed beta, by the end of this month. We're in July, just at the start of July 2020. Now, I don't know what that says about the schedule. People are saying it will be released to the public this year, and it's yet to be seen to what extent that's going to be a realistic proposition moving forward. We don't know anything about what it's going to offer for cockpit builders, whether I'll be able to get this hardware to work. Don't forget, this relies on a whole tower of cards, notably FSU IPC, or the Twin Otter extended software itself at the moment, of course. Linda on top of FSU IPC, Air Manager for the cockpit displays, and also for the autopilot outputs. Whether any of that will be implemented in FS 2020 is unknown. There is plausibly some cause for optimism, you know, that, well, this is a two-way street, but optimism in the sense of backwards compatibility. That new software is said at heart to have been developed from the skeleton of ESP, which is the platform underlying FSX and P3D. So it's possible that some of the infrastructure is sufficiently common to make, you know, redevelopment and redeployment of those other things, FSU, IPC, Linda, Air Manager, onto the new platform, a possibility. The model of distribution, you know, there's still rumours or conflicting opinions about whether this is going to be a subscription-only model. I mean, that's not a great barrier unless it's an enormously expensive subscription. Maybe. We'll see about that. Just the hardware requirements in general, though, and, you know, again, bearing in mind that I want to run a 3-screen display. But the upside is FS 2020 looks, from the promotional materials we've seen, to be just amazing in every respect. Whether that lives up to the advanced publicity, time will tell, of course. Now, in terms of platforms, there is another option, which is X-Plane. You know, X-Plane development has been ploughing on at great speed and wholeheartedly supported by Orbix these days in terms of the scenery products. Now, I've tinkered a little bit with X-Plane 11, but there has been a major upgrade to use this Vulkan platform, which is another step up in terms of graphics. I think Vulkan is an alternative to DX12, but again, it promises, you know, leaps and bounds in terms of the performance that can be squeezed out of your hardware. I think again that would require me to go to Windows 10. I'm not sure about that, but I think Windows 10 is in my future regardless. You know, Windows 7 support has formally ended, I believe, by now. So X-Plane possibly. You know, certainly if I'm going to be faced with completely re-engineering my cockpit, perhaps for a different aircraft, and possibly just reconstructing a new cockpit, that removes many of the barriers of going to X-Plane. So another thing to consider in terms of hardware, you know, I could abandon the, well, let's not say abandon the idea of a cockpit. I like the idea of having buttons and switches physically as inputs, and indeed this cockpit, you may or may not recall, was originally an input-only cockpit. That adds great value over and above trying to use the virtual cockpit. That doesn't mean I can't use the virtual cockpit for output, and one option which may give me much better prospects performance-wise is to go back to a single screen display, and perhaps with a 4K display, and very likely with track IR. Now, I mean, 4K is a big ask already, but I think the indications are that modern hardware is fairly well capable of running a 4K display and still achieve acceptable or even good performance. So that's a possibility which may require me to upgrade my hardware, may not. I mean, that's a big change, but it would be something I'd consider. Now again, all of these different choices intersect. There's a multi-dimensional equation here in terms of thinking how to move forward. So if we just sidestep and think about changing aircraft from the Twin Otter to something else. I mean, there's something else that's on my mind at the moment. The Milviz King Air 350 has been released recently. Now I don't have that aircraft, but it is something I'm looking at, with a view to possibly investing in that. I don't just mean investing in terms of the money, but investing the time and effort in figuring out how I'm going to be able to use that, and then the time and energy to learn about it. Now, the implications for keep sticking with the hardware cockpit with that model are quite significant, shall we say. And I'm saying that because it's based around the ProLine 21 electronic flight instrument system, I think it's called, which is basically everything is on flat panel displays. And so that's all the instrumentation, the GPS weather radar, radio systems, everything is controlled on these flat panel displays, rather like the Garmin G1000. And I think that comes essentially as 3 large format displays. Now it's not clear to me yet whether 2 of those displays are actually just duplicates for the captain and co-pilot positions. So we may get away with 2 of those displays. So a primary flight display and a multi-functional display. In terms of this cockpit layout, it doesn't really match the PL21, but it could be made to fit. The difficulty with that is if I'm going with a 3-screen display, that requires 3 screens for the... well, one thing I've left out here is there is no PL21 system for Air Manager. Air Manager, you'll recall, runs on a separate PC at the moment, so these 2 screens are not driven by the Flight Sim PC. That won't be possible if I were to move to the Milviz King Air. So that would require that I run at least 4, possibly 5, maybe even 6 screens from the Flight Sim computer, which would require me to have 2 graphics cards, and just gives me a whole bucket of new uncertainties, certainly in terms of performance. The good news is the King Air does come with 2D panels for each of those flight displays, which is absolutely essential, really. So it would be possible to, at least in principle, to build a hardware cockpit around that, and that would be my first choice, certainly. But again, the fallback option of using a single 4K display and basically running that from the virtual cockpit, possibly with knobs and buttons and switches to facilitate that, would be a realistic prospect. Whether the performance, I don't know what the performance of that aircraft is likely to be, but it's a very sophisticated model. One of the reasons I'm eyeing that particular aircraft up is it's in some ways it's a similar category of aircraft to the Twin Otter. It's a twin engine turboprop, uses the same engines essentially, and same sort of size aircraft. In many other ways it's not at all similar. It's not a STOL aircraft, certainly not in the sense that the Twin Otter is. So that's where I am at the moment in terms of futures. I'm kind of on pause. There are other options than the King Air. An A2A aircraft, one of the single engine aircraft, is a possibility. And again, all the arguments about the hardware cockpit versus the virtual cockpit and a 4K display apply. If I go back, looking back at the earlier history of this channel, things look very different. I was able to look at multiple aircraft. I made videos, did video reviews. We could get back to something like that if I were to go back to using the virtual cockpit, a single display, track IR. And there's some attractive things about that. I'm not saying I would go back and do loads more reviews. In some sense, the writing of the review is the interesting part of that. The making of the video was sometimes a chore, because basically the content is really the narrative, the story, if you like, and the video stuff is just filler at the end of the day. Okay, they're complementary, but the video part of that is disproportionately labour intensive or a pain in the backside, you might say, to create. But the idea of being able to fly different aircraft, again, to jump in and out, that's quite an attractive idea. And the more I think about this, the more I'm drawn to the idea of having good performance. I think this 3-screen display is just such a millstone. You kind of lose sight of how much of a millstone it is until you sit down and think about it. So maybe that's the future, and that would open up the prospect of, I suppose, much more varied content, more reviews, looking at different aircraft again. So there we are. I'm happy to hear any other thoughts and suggestions about future directions for my channel, or indeed for kinds of content people would like to see.